Hey guys, this is chapter 7 of Chasing Lincoln's Killer. I had to check the title again, sorry. Chapter 7, here we go. Back at Ford's Theater, the investigation was well underway. Stanton was determined to preserve the scene of the crime. He ordered the theater to be surrounded by 24-hour guard. He wanted photographs of the interior of the theater to record exactly how it appeared at the moment of the assassination. Matthew Brady, who had photographed Lincoln many times, now photographed the scene of his murder. He captured the stage and its scenery as it was at the time of the assassination, the exterior of the president's box, the approach to the box, and the outer door leading to the vestibule. Easter Sunday, 1865, would forever be known as Black Easter to those who lived through it. Abraham Lincoln's murder transformed a time of rejoicing in the capital to a time of mourning. Across the country, ministers stayed up late Saturday night and by candle or lamp wrote out final words of sermons they began composing as soon as they heard the terrible news of the president's death. In the early hours of Black Easter, Booth and Herold sought their salvation not in a church but at the door of a loyal Confederate. At the Cox house, Herold dismounted and knocked. Booth stayed on his horse under the cover of a tree in the yard. Cox poked his head out from a second-story window and asked, "Who's there?" Herold refused to give his name, not sure if he could trust the captain. He said only that he was a man who needed help. Suspicious, Cox opened the door and looked over the worn-out, crazy-eyed man standing before him. The stranger seemed more like a boy than a man. The farmer looked around his yard. Booth dismounted with some difficulty and hobbled up the porch to the door. In great pain, he pleaded with Cox for help. But it was there, by brilliant moonlight, that Cox saw the initials J.W.B. tattooed on the hand of the injured stranger. It was there the sweet-talking actor used his charms and talents to win over the man to his cause. Cox swung open the door and invited the fugitives into his home. To the nation, Black Easter dawned as a day of great mourning. To John Wilkes Booth, it began as a day of salvation. Precisely what Booth told Cox on the front porch, and during the next few hours they spent together in the house, remains a mystery. The assassin of the president was there, injured, desperate, and on the run from a manhunt. Given the unusual things Cox and his son were about to do for Booth, given Booth's state of mind, there is little doubt that Booth confessed all to his hosts. Father and son saw the murderer and his accomplice and decided to help them. Cox helped them decide on their next move. He told Booth there was one man who could get them safely across the Potomac River. That man was Thomas Jones. They would summon Thomas Jones after sunrise the next morning. For now, it was too dangerous for Booth and Herold to remain at Cox Farm. Instead, they would hide in a heavily wooded pine thicket some distance away. No one would search for them there. Cox reassured them, and it was unlikely any locals would happen to see them there. They were not to build a fire, someone might see it. In the morning, someone would come to them, and that person would signal with a specific 3-note whistle as he approached. They were to beware anyone who did not make that sound. Booth and Herold ate the food Cox offered them, saddled up for the ride to the pine thicket, and rode off with Cox's overseer as their guide. If their luck held, they would cross Virginia sometime after nightfall within 24 hours. If, that is, they could survive just one more day in Maryland. Booth and Herold entered the pines, dismounted, and tied off their horses. Exhausted, the two men unrolled their blankets in the damp earth, laid down, and gazed up at the immense black sky decorated by countless points of twinkling light. Could be morning in a few hours. If Captain Cox's word was true, it was safe to doze off until then. The rising sun and chirping birds woke Booth and Herold early in the morning. Now they could do nothing but wait. Back at the farm, Captain Cox had to find out whether his friend would actually help Booth and Herold. He sent his son to fetch Thomas Jones right away. Thomas Jones was a Confederate Secret Service veteran who had spent his entire life trailblazing through the fields, thickets, and forests of rural Maryland, navigating its streams, marshes, and rivers. During the war, he had ferried hundreds of men and the occasional female spy across the Potomac River between Maryland and Virginia. He transported the Confederate mail between the two states and sent south fresh Union papers and provided information and valuable to the Confederacy. Jones was a valuable and mysterious secret agent operating along the watery borders between the Union and Confederate territory. The Union Army had never caught him in action. He was a river ghost to the boys in blue uniforms. His knowledge of the river enabled him to calculate the best time to begin a trip across. They should leave a little before sunset, when the reflection in the water of the high bluffs near Pope's Creek extended out into the Potomac until it nearly met the shadows cast by the Virginia woods. It would be difficult to spot a small rowboat floating in the river. Jones's service to the Confederacy had cost him a great deal. Suspected of disloyalty to the Union, federal forces arrested and jailed him for months in the old Capitol prison in Washington. When Jones went to the Confederate capital, Richmond, at the beginning of April 1865, to collect money owed him by the Confederacy, he discovered that the army had evacuated the city and he went unpaid. He lost $2,300 owed him for 3 years of service, along with all the money he had invested in Confederate bonds at the beginning of the war. All this meant Jones needed as much money as he could lay his hands on. At Jones' farm, the Cox boy told Jones his father wished to see him at once. Some strangers were at our house last night, the boy said. Jones' eyes lit up. Could he mean the heroes who assassinated President Lincoln? The report excited Jones. The day before, Jones learned from Union soldiers that Lincoln had been assassinated, and they had information that the assassins had traveled this way. Jones felt it in his bones. Captain Cox wanted to see him about something connected to the assassination. Jones saddled up and accompanied young Cox to his father's farm. Once he arrived, Captain Cox and Thomas Jones spoke casually for a few minutes until Cox could avoid the subject no longer. "Tom, I had visitors about 4 o'clock this morning," Cox revealed. "They want to get across the river." He spoke in a whisper. "Have you heard that Lincoln was killed Friday night?" "Yes," Jones replied, telling Cox about what he had learned about the assassination from the Union soldiers. Cox finally blurted out, "Tom, we must get those men who were here this morning across the river." Then he told Jones everything about the late-night visit from Booth and Herold. Jones was no coward. 4 years of loyal, dangerous service to the Confederacy had proved that. But the war was over. Jones considered the situation, then he made up his mind. "I'll see what I can do," he said. "I must see the men. Where are they?" Captain Cox told Jones that Booth and Herold spent the night in the pine thicket. Lincoln's killer was there now, waiting for someone to rescue him. Cox gave Jones the whistle code, a set of 3 notes, and cautioned him to approach the fugitives carefully. "They're fully armed and might shoot you through mistake," he warned. Alone, Jones rode toward his meeting with Lincoln's assassins. At the edge of the thicket, he stopped, whistled the 3 notes, and waited. David Herold rose from the brush and aimed his Spencer carbine at him. The weapon was cocked and ready to fire. "Who are you, and what do you want?" demanded Herold. Jones told Herold that Cox had sent him, that he was a friend. Herold relaxed his grip on the gun and said, "Follow me." He took Jones deeper into the pines, through the thick undergrowth, to a man partly concealed by the brush. Jones, overcome by a mixture of thrill and fear, saw John Wilkes Booth for the first time. He later recalled that Booth was dressed in stained dark clothes. Booth was very pale, and his face bore signs of suffering. Booth confided what Jones already knew. Booth had killed Lincoln. The assassin understood that the odds of escape were against him. He also vowed that he would never be taken alive. Jones was sure he meant it. Jones proposed a plan. He would help Booth and Herold cross the Potomac River to Virginia, but they must leave it to him to decide when and how they would make the attempt. Patience was essential. Meanwhile, Jones would feed them and make preparations for their crossing. Booth and Herold must not leave the pine thicket, make any noise, or do anything that might let anyone know they were there. Jones said that to cross the river they needed a dark night, smooth water, and deserted riverbanks. It would be best to wait for the departure of many of the soldiers and detectives who had already followed Booth south into Maryland. That might take days, and there would be no doctor for Booth until they crossed the river. Jones persuaded the assassins that the best way to escape was to stop running and go into hiding. Manhunters were already nearby. Soon federal forces would join Lieutenant Dana and fan out across the part of Maryland Booth and Herold were in. They would remain in hiding and let the manhunters sweep through the county before they moved on. So what he's saying is like the army is already here. Let them do their investigation and move on, and then you can go. So essentially, like, they were ahead of the manhunters. Now the manhunters have caught up to them. They're going to let the manhunters go forward, and then they'll go behind the manhunt. Booth's curiosity about public reaction to the assassination led him to make an additional request of Jones. "Please bring some current Washington papers from the day Lincoln died, or from today, the 16th. Despite his pain and exhaustion, the actor was eager to read about the deed in the papers. Like, this guy is really stuck on himself. Jones mounted his horse, maneuvered through the pine trees, and vanished from sight. Until Jones' return, Booth and Harold were on their own. With his simple plan, Jones foiled the whole manhunt for John Wilkes Booth. A single Confederate agent, nearly penniless, had just frustrated the frantic pursuit by thousands of men being directed from Washington by Secretary of War Stanton. Late on Easter morning, pause. This is a copy of one of the newspapers that John Wilkes Booth would have asked for. Okay. Later on Easter morning, George Atzerodt showed up at the home of Hezekiah Metz, about 22 miles from Washington in Montgomery County, Maryland, north of Charles County, where Booth and Harold were. Atzerodt joined Metz and 3 of his guests for a midday meal. One of the guests had known him for years, and when Atzerodt arrived, he teased him. "Are you that man that killed Abe Lincoln?" The joke must have frozen Atzerodt in his tracks. Atzerodt laughed and said yes. He also confirmed for the guest that Seward's throat had been cut, his sons attacked. Atzerodt, the slow-witted German, did not know it, but he had just sealed his fate. One of the guests would inform the local authorities of Atzerodt's boast. After dinner, Atzerodt, unaware that he'd aroused suspicion of his guests, traveled home to the home of his cousin, Hartman Richter, arriving after 2 p.m. So remember, Atzerodt was supposed to kill the vice president and chickened out. So he really was part of the plot, but ultimately did nothing that night. That day, Samuel Mudd considered his situation. At some point, probably soon, the soldiers or detectives would discover 2 things about him. He had visitors on assassination night, and even more damning, he had known ties to Booth. He did not wish to betray Booth, but too many people at Mudd's farm had seen Booth and Harold for Mudd to keep the visit a secret. Mudd solved the problem by sending his cousin, George, a loyal Unionist and therefore above suspicion by the federal authorities to town to report Booth's visit to Mudd Farm. So he sends his cousin to say that Mudd had visitors that night. The vague second-handed report he would deliver would not likely cause the soldiers to leap into their saddles in pursuit of the 2 strangers. Through the afternoon and into the evening, Mudd awaited the arrival of the manhunters, but they did not come, in a stroke of good luck for Booth. For unknown reasons, Samuel Mudd's cousin George failed to ride into town to report the strangers to the cavalry. The delay gave Booth an additional lead over his pursuers. In Washington, the manhunt had progressed little. John Wilkes Booth had assassinated the president almost 48 hours before, but the manhunters had no solid leads. Yes, the police, detectives, and officers had found a number of leads on Booth's accomplices, but none led to Booth. Hats, the Derringer pistol, abandoned knives, broken revolvers, jackets, one-eyed horses, bank books, mysterious letters, hotel registers, notes to vice presidents, trunks, rope, spurs, bridles, saddles, and eyewitness accounts were all fine clues that made the assassin seem very vivid and near. These would make good evidence at a criminal trial as proof of identity and guilt. The evidence already collected by April 15th confirmed that it was Booth who had shot Lincoln and that he seemed to have several accomplices. The contents of Atzerodt's room at the Kirkwood, plus Booth's Sam letter, argued that the vice president had also been marked for death. The evidence pointed to Booth's guilt, but not to how he planned to make his escape. Booth could be anywhere. Many false sightings across the country made pursuing more difficult. With each passing hour, Booth's trail grew a little colder. Soon, he would disappear forever. Booth's skill at avoiding the manhunters increased the government's embarrassment over its failure to find him. On the night of April 16th, Stanton had no idea of John Wilkes Booth's location or destination. Yes, it was probably Booth who gave the name Booth to Sergeant Cobb at the bridge and fled into Maryland. But where did he go after that? Remember, he had to get across that bridge that was supposed to close at 9. On Monday, April 17th, Thomas Jones appeared to go about his business as usual. He did his chores, ate his usual breakfast. He grabbed some bread, butter, and ham, filled a flask with coffee, and stuffed everything into his pockets. He folded the newspapers and stashed them in his coat. He carried a basket of corn on his arm to throw off any Union troops he might encounter. If stopped and questioned, he could claim that he was on his way to feed his hogs, which ran free in the woods. A little before 10 a.m., Jones rode toward the pine thicket. About 100 yards from Booth's camp, Jones dismounted, walked very slowly, and whistled the secret signal as he came within earshot of the assassins. Booth and Harold welcomed him and the food he brought with open arms. Booth was especially eager to see the other treats Jones brought, the newspapers. At last, 3 long days after the assassination, he could read about the history-making actions and how they were reported to the nation. He must have delighted in reading the details of the assassination as reported in the papers, as though reading the reviews of a performance. Booth's pleasure at reading about his success in killing Lincoln could not hide his worsening condition. His leg was in bad shape, and Booth was obviously in great pain. As Jones discussed the escape plan with Booth and Harold, he became distracted when he heard a familiar, terrifying sound in the distance, clanking metal and horses' hooves pounding the earth. Instantly, Jones recognized the sounds. Cavalry sabers slapping the saddles of Union troops riding in their direction. It was too late for them to try and hoist Booth onto a saddle to attempt escape. Fight was out of the question. Booth could not walk, Jones was unarmed, and Harold had never been in a battle before. With only 2 revolvers and 1 carbine, they couldn't hold off a patrol of Union cavalry for long. The 3 men hugged the ground and held their breath. The cavalry horses got within 200 yards. It was Booth's closest brush with capture since he had galloped down the alley behind Ford's Theater. Luckily for Booth, instead of running into the thicket, the troops remained on the road, past the thicket, and rode until the sound of hoofbeats vanished in the distance. Jones locked eyes with Booth. "You see, my friend, we must wait." "Yes," Booth agreed. "I'll leave it all with you." On the morning of the 17th, another man waited too. Troops still had not called on Dr. Mudd to pursue his tip, because they still did not know about it. It wasn't until the next morning that George Mudd rode into Bryantown. He made a vague report to Lieutenant Dana. 2 suspicious strangers visited his cousin's farm seeking medical attention. Then, in another unbelievable stroke of good luck for Booth and Harold, Dana ignored the news as old and unimportant. He thanked George Mudd and sent him on his way. He did not send troops to Mudd's farm to investigate. Distracted by other leads, many of them dead ends, Lieutenant Dana ignored the one tip that placed Lincoln's assassin within his reach. The soldiers had not come by his farm that evening. Dr. Mudd relaxed. Perhaps at this point they would not come at all. With the assassin's trail in Maryland growing cold, the soldiers would soon leave and shift the action to other places far from Bryantown and his farm. Thomas Jones had experienced enough excitement for one day. He agreed to return to the thicket to feed Booth and Harold the next morning, but he refused to bring horse feed again. It was difficult to carry enough feed for the horses, and Jones feared a passing cavalry patrol would hear their horses, which were hungry, restless, and noisy. The horses had served them well, and Harold loved animals, but they all agreed that the horses must be disposed of. The horses' reward for faithful service was death. Harold led them to a quicksand pit about a mile away, shot them, and sank their bodies. Harold returned to the thicket and sat on the ground beside Booth. Never during their escape were they more vulnerable and alone. If the Union cavalry found them now, they would not be able to make a run for it. Exhausted, injured, Booth could not hope to outrun a mounted pursuit, and if Thomas Jones abandoned them, how would they find their way across the river? Later, in the safety of the night, Booth and Harold rolled out their woolen blankets and spent another night on the ground.